He was the emperor of the world's most sacred empire, until he fell in love. When Constantine VI married Theodote, a woman more forbidden than a heretic scroll, he defied divine law, shattered church loyalty, and unleashed a crisis that no sword could stop. Monks rebelled. Bishops broke ranks. His own mother saw a chance and took it. A single wedding lit the fuse on a rebellion that blinded a king and crowned a traitor. What was so dangerous about this union that it nearly destroyed Byzantium from within, like for betrayal? Comment: if love can be a crime, and subscribe to uncover how this one marriage toppled an empire. The golden sun cast long shadows across the marble corridors of Constantinople as Emperor Constantine VI walked toward a decision that would shatter an empire spanning 3 continents. His footsteps echoed against walls that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless rulers, but none would face the peculiar destruction that awaited this young sovereign. The year was 795, and the Byzantine Empire stood at the precipice of a crisis that would make theologians weep, and historians marvel at how a single wedding ceremony could topple what armies had failed to conquer for centuries. In the imperial chambers, adorned with silk tapestries depicting Christ's triumph over earthly kingdoms, Constantine's hands trembled as he held the marriage contract that would bind him to Theodote, a woman whose beauty had captivated his heart, but whose very existence threatened to unravel the spiritual foundation upon which his empire rested. The parchment felt heavier than the crown upon his head, for within its carefully inscribed words lay the seeds of a catastrophe that would echo through generations. The emperor's first marriage to Maria of Amnia had produced no male heir, only a daughter named Euphrosyna, and the political pressure for a son had become unbearable. Yet what seemed like a simple solution to a dynastic problem would prove to be the most devastating mistake in Byzantine history. The Empress Irene, Constantine's own mother, paced in her private chapel like a caged lioness, her fingers clutching prayer beads worn smooth by decades of manipulation and scheming. She had ruled as regent during her son's youth, tasting power sweeter than honey, and the thought of losing influence over imperial policy through her son's remarriage filled her with a rage that burned hotter than Greek fire. Her advisors whispered that encouraging this forbidden union might serve her purposes, for surely the church would condemn such an act, weakening Constantine's legitimacy and opening pathways for her return to absolute power. The irony was delicious and terrible. A mother who would use her son's heart against him, weaponizing love itself in the deadly game of imperial politics. Patriarch Tarasios stood before the altar of Hagia Sophia, his weathered face etched with lines of anguish as he contemplated the impossible choice before him. The great dome above seemed to press down upon his shoulders like the weight of divine judgment itself. Canon law was crystal clear about divorce and remarriage while a first spouse lived, yet here stood an emperor demanding ecclesiastical blessing for an act that would violate the very foundations of Christian marriage. The patriarch's voice caught in his throat as he remembered his ordination vows, the sacred promises that bound him to uphold church doctrine even unto death. Yet defying an emperor meant exile, disgrace, perhaps worse fates that had befallen previous patriarchs who dared oppose imperial will. The streets of Constantinople buzzed with whispered conversations as news of the emperor's intentions spread like wildfire through the markets and taverns. Common citizens gathered in small groups, their voices dropping to urgent murmurs when discussing their sovereign's scandalous plans. Merchants paused in their negotiations to debate whether God would punish the entire empire for their ruler's transgression, while mothers clutched their children closer, fearing divine retribution might manifest as plague, famine, or barbarian invasion. The city's pulse quickened with an undercurrent of dread, for everyone understood that when emperors defied heaven, it was always the innocent who suffered most severely in the cosmic reckoning that inevitably followed. In monasteries scattered across Anatolia, monks spent sleepless nights prostrated before icons, their tears mixing with incense smoke as they prayed for their emperor's soul and their empire's survival. Brother Methodios, whose chronicles would later preserve these dark days for posterity, wrote by candlelight with ink that seemed to bleed upon the parchment. The very foundations of our sacred order tremble, for when the protector of the faith becomes its destroyer, what hope remains for the faithful? His words captured the theological vertigo gripping the empire as subjects struggled to comprehend how their divinely appointed ruler could simultaneously embody God's will and violate God's law. The wedding ceremony itself unfolded like a fever dream in the palace chapel, with only a handful of complicit priests willing to perform the ritual. Theodote wore robes of imperial purple that seemed to weigh upon her slender frame like chains of destiny. Her beauty unable to mask the terror in her eyes as she realized she was becoming not just an empress, but a catalyst for catastrophe. Constantine's voice shook as he recited vows that he knew were simultaneously binding him to his beloved and condemning his empire to spiritual crisis. The words echoed strangely in the small chapel, as if the very walls rejected their utterance, and several witnesses later swore they heard thunder rumbling from a cloudless sky as the couple exchanged rings. The reaction from the church hierarchy was swift and merciless, like divine lightning striking the imperial palace. Patriarch Tarasios, who had reluctantly performed the ceremony under extreme imperial pressure, found himself caught between irreconcilable forces as monasteries across the empire erupted in protest. The Studite monks, led by the fierce and uncompromising Theodore Studites, declared the marriage invalid and began organizing systematic resistance to imperial religious policy. Their monastery became a fortress of orthodoxy, where prayer and defiance merged into a powerful weapon against imperial authority. Theodore's fiery sermons denounced the emperor as a tyrant who had placed personal desire above divine law, and his words spread through the empire's monasteries like sacred wildfire. The political ramifications cascaded through the imperial administration with devastating efficiency. Provincial governors found themselves torn between loyalty to their emperor and allegiance to church doctrine, creating a paralysis in government that left borders vulnerable and tax collection disrupted. The empire's enemies, always alert to signs of internal weakness, began probing frontier defenses with increasing boldness. Harun al-Rashid, the brilliant Abbasid caliph, received detailed reports from his spies about the Byzantine crisis and immediately began planning military campaigns to exploit the empire's spiritual and political turmoil. The forbidden marriage had opened wounds that would take generations to heal, if they ever could be healed at all. Theodore Studites emerged as the conscience of the empire, his monastery becoming a beacon of resistance that attracted supporters from across the Byzantine territories. His letters, smuggled throughout the empire despite imperial attempts at censorship, articulated the theological horror of the situation with devastating clarity. When the shepherd becomes the wolf who shall protect the flock, he wrote in one particularly damning epistle that circulated through underground networks of faithful believers. His words resonated in monasteries, parish churches, and private homes where families gathered to debate whether obedience to an emperor could coexist with obedience to God. The Studite position was uncompromising. No earthly authority, regardless of divine appointment, could override the fundamental laws of Christian marriage. The Empress Mother Irene watched these developments with calculating satisfaction, her political instincts recognizing opportunity in crisis. She began quietly cultivating relationships with church leaders opposed to her son's marriage, presenting herself as a defender of Orthodox faith against imperial tyranny. Her agents spread carefully crafted rumors about Constantine's moral character, suggesting that his violation of marriage law was merely the first step toward complete apostasy. The irony was breathtaking. A woman who had previously shown little concern for theological niceties now positioned herself as Christianity's champion, using her son's genuine love as a weapon to destroy his legitimacy and clear her path back to supreme power. As months passed, the empire began experiencing what contemporaries described as divine displeasure made manifest in earthly events. Harvest failures struck multiple provinces simultaneously, creating food shortages that sparked riots in major cities. The granaries of Constantinople, once overflowing with tribute from fertile Anatolian valleys, stood eerily empty as peasants hoarded grain and merchants refused to transport goods through regions gripped by religious upheaval. Earthquakes rattled important religious centers, toppling church buildings, while leaving pagan ruins mysteriously intact. The great lighthouse of Alexandria suffered damage that ship's captains interpreted as an omen of navigational disasters to come. Plague appeared in port cities, spreading along trade routes with terrifying efficiency, killing rich and poor alike, while priests debated whether the pestilence represented God's judgment upon a sinful empire. Whether these calamities were truly supernatural punishment or merely unfortunate coincidences mattered less than popular perception, and throughout the empire, citizens increasingly viewed their mounting troubles as divine wrath against their emperor's forbidden marriage. Street preachers in Constantinople's forums drew massive crowds with sermons connecting every misfortune to the imperial transgression, while rural priests modified traditional liturgies to include prayers for deliverance from the curse of unlawful union. The empire's sophisticated administrative machinery began grinding to a halt, as officials at every level questioned whether executing imperial commands might implicate them in cosmic crime. The military began showing signs of dangerous instability, as soldiers questioned whether they could serve an emperor who had forfeited divine protection through his defiance of church law. Unit commanders reported increasing incidents of insubordination, desertion, and outright mutiny as troops lost confidence in their supreme commander's spiritual legitimacy. The empire's sophisticated military machine, built on centuries of discipline and loyalty, began grinding to a halt as the philosophical foundations of imperial authority crumbled. Veteran centurions who had fought barbarians across 3 continents found themselves unable to maintain order among men who believed their banners had been cursed by association with sacrilege. Enemy forces pressing against the borders encountered Byzantine defenders who fought with the desperate fury of men who believed they were already damned by association with their rulers' sins. The Bulgars, always eager to test Byzantine resolve, launched probing attacks across the Danube frontier and discovered demoralized garrisons whose commanders seemed more concerned with theological debates than military preparedness. Arab raiders striking from Syria encountered border fortifications where disputes between pro-imperial and anti-imperial factions had weakened defensive coordination to the point of collapse. The empire that had once projected invincible strength now radiated uncertainty and internal division that invited aggression from every direction. In the imperial palace, Constantine found himself increasingly isolated as courtiers and advisors distanced themselves from potential association with his controversial marriage. The emperor, who had once commanded absolute obedience, now discovered that power without legitimacy was merely an illusion waiting to shatter. His beloved Theodote, the woman for whom he had risked everything, became a prisoner of her own elevation, surrounded by hostile stares and whispered curses from servants who blamed her beauty for their empire's troubles. The couple's private moments were haunted by the knowledge that their love had become a curse upon millions of innocent subjects who would suffer for their sovereign's choices. Palace life transformed into a nightmare of suspicion and paranoia, as Constantine struggled to identify loyal supporters among a court increasingly dominated by his mother's agents. Former friends avoided eye contact during official ceremonies, while trusted advisors submitted reports that subtly questioned imperial policies without directly challenging imperial authority. The emperor's personal bodyguard, once recruited from the most loyal military units, now included men whose primary allegiance might lie with other power centers. Every meal became a potential poisoning opportunity. Every private conversation, a possible intelligence-gathering operation. Every moment of sleep a vulnerability that enemies might exploit. Theodore Studites intensified his resistance campaign, organizing what amounted to an underground network of Orthodox believers committed to defying imperial religious policy. His monastery's scriptorium produced a steady stream of treatises, letters, and theological arguments that systematically demolished any justification for the emperor's marriage. These documents circulated throughout the empire, despite imperial efforts at suppression, creating a parallel discourse that challenged the fundamental premises of Constantine's rule. The monk's influence extended far beyond religious circles, inspiring secular opposition figures who recognized the political opportunities created by the emperor's weakened moral authority. The Studite network developed sophisticated methods for evading imperial censorship, using coded language in ostensibly innocent religious texts and establishing hidden routes for distributing prohibited materials. Sympathetic merchants carried concealed documents along trade routes, while pilgrims visiting holy sites served as unwitting couriers for revolutionary correspondence. The movement's growth exceeded even Theodore's expectations, as ordinary citizens desperate for spiritual guidance gravitated toward leaders who offered clear moral direction in a time of unprecedented confusion. The breaking point arrived when Patriarch Tarasios, unable to withstand the mounting pressure from orthodox elements within the church, publicly recanted his role in performing the marriage ceremony. Standing before a packed congregation in Hagia Sophia, his voice breaking with emotion, the patriarch declared that he had acted under duress and that the imperial marriage was invalid in God's eyes. The dramatic reversal sent shockwaves through the empire's political establishment as the highest religious authority essentially declared the emperor's most important personal relationship to be sinful and illegitimate. The congregation's response was immediate and overwhelming. Spontaneous prayers of thanksgiving rose from thousands of voices, while tears of relief streamed down faces that had carried the burden of their patriarch's compromised position. Constantine's response was swift and vindictive. Tarasios was immediately stripped of his position and exiled to a remote monastery on the empire's eastern frontier, but the damage to imperial prestige was irreversible. The sight of imperial guards forcibly removing the empire's highest religious official from his cathedral seat created images that would haunt Byzantine consciousness for generations. Citizens who witnessed the patriarch's arrest spoke of divine judgment manifesting through earthly authority, while opposition propagandists transformed the incident into proof of imperial tyranny run amok. The crisis deepened when several provincial bishops followed Tarasios' example, publicly declaring their opposition to the imperial marriage and calling upon their congregations to pray for the emperor's repentance. These acts of defiance created a cascading effect throughout the church hierarchy, as religious leaders faced impossible choices between career survival and theological conviction. Many chose martyrdom over compromise, accepting exile, imprisonment, or worse, rather than legitimize what they viewed as a fundamental violation of Christian law. Their suffering became a rallying point for opposition movements that portrayed Constantine not as a divinely appointed ruler, but as a tyrant who persecuted the faithful to satisfy his carnal desires. The Bishop of Ephesus delivered a particularly powerful sermon that was transcribed and distributed throughout Asia Minor, declaring that true Christians owed no obedience to rulers who placed themselves above God's law. His words struck like lightning through communities already destabilized by economic hardship and military insecurity, providing theological justification for resistance that many had felt but feared to express. When imperial authorities arrested the bishop for sedition, his congregation rioted, requiring military intervention that left several citizens dead and many more injured. Empress Irene seized upon the chaos with ruthless efficiency, positioning herself as the natural alternative to her discredited son. Her agents worked tirelessly to cultivate support among military commanders, court officials, and provincial governors who had lost confidence in Constantine's ability to maintain order and legitimacy. She presented herself as a return to orthodox government, promising to restore proper relations between church and state, while maintaining the empire's strength against external enemies. Her propaganda machine portrayed the choice facing the empire in stark terms: continue following a ruler whose personal sins had forfeited divine protection, or embrace a leader committed to restoring God's favor through righteous governance. The Empress Mother's campaign was masterfully orchestrated, combining genuine religious conviction with calculated political maneuvering. She sponsored public prayers for the empire's spiritual recovery, while privately negotiating with key military commanders about the practical mechanics of regime change. Her supporters emphasized that deposing Constantine would not represent rebellion against legitimate authority, but rather restoration of proper imperial conduct after a period of aberrant behavior. The argument proved persuasive to many who sought justification for actions they already desired to take. Secret meetings in the palace's hidden chambers brought together an unlikely coalition of religious zealots, pragmatic politicians, and ambitious military officers, united only by their conviction that Constantine's continued rule threatened the empire's survival. These conspirators developed detailed plans for a coup that would minimize bloodshed while maximizing legitimacy, recognizing that successful regime change required not just military force, but popular acceptance. Their preparations included securing control of key strategic points throughout Constantinople, ensuring the loyalty of crucial military units, and preparing proclamations explaining the necessity of their actions to both domestic and international audiences. The final catastrophe arrived with stunning swiftness when a coalition of military commanders, religious leaders, and court officials united behind Irene's claim to supreme power. Constantine, isolated and discredited, found himself facing a palace coup that enjoyed support across all levels of Byzantine society. His loyal guards melted away as former supporters calculated that association with a fallen emperor was political suicide. The man who had defied heaven for love discovered that earthly power without divine sanction was ultimately powerless against the combined forces of orthodox resistance and maternal ambition. The coup unfolded with surgical precision as key installations throughout Constantinople fell to Irene's supporters without significant resistance. The imperial treasury, the arsenal, the palace guard barracks, and the city's gates all changed hands in coordinated operations that demonstrated the conspirators' thorough preparation. Constantine's attempts to rally support met with polite refusals from commanders who claimed pressing duties elsewhere, leaving the emperor to face his destiny with only a handful of personal servants whose loyalty stemmed from affection rather than political calculation. The deposition ceremony in the palace throne room carried the weight of theological judgment as much as political transition. Irene's supporters systematically stripped Constantine of the symbols and prerogatives of imperial authority, each action accompanied by pronouncements about divine justice and the restoration of proper order. The crown that had weighed so heavily upon Constantine's head was removed with ritualistic solemnity, while prayers of thanksgiving rose from the assembled crowd. The emperor, who had risked everything for forbidden love, found himself reduced to a private citizen whose very existence threatened his mother's newly restored authority. The symbolism was deliberate and devastating. The imperial purple robe was folded carefully and placed upon Irene's shoulders, while Constantine stood in simple white garments that emphasized his fall from supreme power to ordinary mortality. The imperial seal was transferred from son to mother, with ceremonies that invoked biblical precedents of divine judgment against sinful rulers. Contemporary observers noted the theatrical quality of the proceedings, as if the participants recognized they were performing not just a political transition, but a moral drama, whose lessons would echo through future generations. The aftermath was brutal and comprehensive in its scope. Constantine was blinded in a ceremony that combined political necessity with symbolic justice, his eyes destroyed by the same imperial officials who had once executed his commands without question. The man who had seen beauty in forbidden love would never again witness the world's visual splendor, spending his remaining years in monastic confinement, where darkness became his permanent companion. The blinding took place in the purple chamber where Constantine had been born, adding layers of tragic irony to his punishment, as the room that had witnessed his entry into imperial life became the site of his exit from the world of sight. Theodote, the woman whose beauty had triggered an empire's collapse, disappeared into historical obscurity, her fate unknown but certainly tragic. Some chronicles suggest she was forced into a convent, where she spent her remaining years in penitential prayer, while others hint at more violent endings for the woman who had unknowingly become the catalyst for imperial catastrophe. Her beauty, once celebrated by court poets as rivaling Helen of Troy, became a cautionary tale about the dangerous power of feminine allure when it collided with political necessity. The few surviving descriptions of her final days speak of a woman aged beyond her years by grief and guilt, her legendary loveliness transformed into haunting fragility. Irene's restoration to supreme power represented more than a simple dynastic change. It marked the triumph of orthodox religious authority over imperial autonomy in matters of faith and morals. The new empress immediately began implementing policies designed to demonstrate her commitment to proper Christian governance, restoring exiled bishops, rebuilding damaged churches, and ostentatiously displaying her devotion to orthodox theology. Yet the empire that emerged from this crisis was fundamentally weakened, its authority structures damaged by the revelation that imperial power was not absolute when confronted by determined religious opposition. The religious reforms initiated by Irene were sweeping and systematic, touching every aspect of Byzantine spiritual life. New laws reinforced the permanence of Christian marriage while imposing severe penalties for adultery and divorce. Monastic communities received generous imperial donations as reward for their resistance to the previous regime's policies. The empress personally participated in elaborate religious ceremonies designed to demonstrate imperial submission to divine authority, creating visual spectacles that reinforce the message that earthly power must always defer to heavenly mandate. Yet these reforms came at enormous cost to imperial prestige and practical authority. The precedent of successful resistance to imperial religious policy created ongoing challenges to Irene's own rule as various groups tested the boundaries of acceptable opposition. The empire's enemies, having observed how internal religious disputes could paralyze Byzantine decision-making, began incorporating theological warfare into their strategic planning. The Bulgars supported heterodox Christian sects within Byzantine territory, while the Arabs funded missionary activities designed to create doctrinal confusion among frontier populations. The economic consequences of the crisis proved almost as devastating as the political aftermath. Trade disruptions caused by civil unrest and religious uncertainty had damaged commercial relationships that took decades to rebuild. The empire's currency, once accepted throughout the Mediterranean world as a symbol of stability, now carried associations with political chaos that reduced its international value. Tax revenues from provinces affected by the religious crisis remained below pre-coup levels for years, as local populations struggled to recover from the economic disruption caused by governmental paralysis. Military reforms implemented by Irene attempted to address the loyalty problems that had contributed to her son's downfall, but these changes created new vulnerabilities even as they solved old problems. The Empress promoted commanders based on religious orthodoxy rather than military competence, creating an officer corps strong in theological conviction but sometimes weak in tactical ability. New oath-taking ceremonies required soldiers to swear allegiance to Orthodox Christianity as well as imperial authority. But these complex loyalties created confusion during military operations that required quick decision-making. The forbidden marriage that had seemed like a simple solution to Constantine's dynastic problems ultimately revealed the delicate balance of forces that maintained Byzantine civilization. When personal desire conflicted with religious law, when imperial authority challenged ecclesiastical doctrine, when love confronted political necessity, the resulting explosion destroyed not only the individuals involved, but the carefully constructed legitimacy that held the empire together. The tragedy was complete in its scope. An emperor destroyed by his heart, a woman ruined by her beauty, a mother who gained power by sacrificing her son, and an empire that survived by consuming its own ruler. The international ramifications of the Byzantine crisis extended far beyond the empire's borders, as neighboring powers recalculated their strategic relationships with Constantinople. The Frankish kingdom under Charlemagne viewed the religious upheaval as evidence of Byzantine weakness and began more aggressive diplomatic initiatives designed to assert Western Christian superiority over Eastern Christianity. The Pope in Rome interpreted the crisis as divine punishment for Byzantine theological errors and increased pressure for doctrinal conformity with Roman positions. The historical lessons embedded in this catastrophe resonated through subsequent centuries as rulers learned to navigate the treacherous waters where personal desire intersected with public duty. The Byzantine Empire's survival of this crisis demonstrated both its resilience and its vulnerability, showing how quickly seemingly absolute power could crumble when divorced from moral authority. Future emperors would remember Constantine VI as a cautionary tale about the price of defying the foundations upon which their power rested, while church leaders would point to Theodote's Theodote as an example of how faithful resistance could triumph over tyrannical authority. The Theodotite movement's success in opposing imperial religious policy established precedents that would influence church-state relations throughout the medieval period. Theodote's theological arguments about the limits of imperial authority became standard references in debates about political legitimacy and religious freedom. His letters, preserved in monastic libraries throughout the empire, provided intellectual frameworks for future resistance movements facing similar conflicts between earthly and divine authority. The empire that emerged from this crucible was scarred but wiser, its institutions tempered by crisis, and its leaders educated in the harsh realities of power's limitations. Yet the fundamental tensions between imperial authority and religious doctrine remained unresolved, creating fault lines that would generate future conflicts as Byzantine civilization continued its complex dance between earthly power and heavenly mandate. The forbidden marriage had ended. The immediate crisis had passed. But the questions it raised about authority, legitimacy, and the proper relationship between rulers and ruled would echo through the corridors of power for generations to come. Administrative reforms implemented in the aftermath of the crisis attempted to prevent similar confrontations between imperial and ecclesiastical authority, but these measures could not eliminate the underlying philosophical tensions that had caused the original conflict. New protocols required consultation with church leadership before major policy decisions, but these procedures created bureaucratic delays that hampered governmental efficiency. The empire's legal system incorporated additional religious oversight mechanisms, but these changes sometimes produced contradictory rulings when secular and spiritual authorities disagreed about proper interpretation of imperial law. Cultural changes flowing from the crisis proved equally profound and lasting. Byzantine art and literature began reflecting heightened awareness of the dangers inherent in imperial power, with new works emphasizing themes of humility, divine judgment, and the temporary nature of earthly authority. Court ceremonies incorporated additional religious elements designed to demonstrate imperial submission to divine will, while architectural projects emphasized sacred rather than secular themes. The empire's educational system began including more extensive religious instruction, as authorities sought to prevent future generations from repeating Constantine's theological errors. In the end, Constantine VI's tragedy illuminated the terrible mathematics of imperial power, that love, however genuine, could not overcome the structural realities of Byzantine civilization, that personal happiness was always secondary to public order, and that even emperors were ultimately servants of forces greater than their individual desires. The empire had survived by sacrificing its ruler, demonstrating both the ruthless pragmatism that enabled Byzantine civilization to endure for centuries and the human cost of maintaining complex societies where individual will must always yield to collective necessity. The forbidden marriage had demanded a price that ultimately proved too high for any individual to pay, regardless of their exalted position. Constantine's attempt to reconcile personal desire with public duty had failed not because of any personal inadequacy, but because the contradiction itself was irreconcilable within the framework of Byzantine imperial ideology. His tragedy became a permanent reminder that even the most powerful individuals remained subject to forces beyond their control, and that the empire's survival sometimes required the destruction of those who ruled it. Years later, as historians attempted to understand how a single marriage ceremony had triggered such comprehensive political transformation, they would recognize that Constantine's forbidden union had merely exposed weaknesses that already existed within Byzantine imperial structure. The crisis had revealed the limits of imperial authority when confronted by determined religious opposition, the power of moral legitimacy in political conflicts, and the dangerous instability created when personal desire conflicted with institutional necessity. The empire had survived this particular test, but the lessons learned would forever change how Byzantine rulers understood the nature and limitations of their power. Constantine VI followed his heart and paid with his crown, his sight, and his legacy. His love for Theodote cracked the holy order of Byzantium, pitting monk against monarch and mother against son. In the end, love didn't save him, it damned him. Irene claimed the throne, the church reclaimed its power, and Constantine vanished into darkness, blinded, broken, and erased. If this downfall stunned you, like this video, subscribe for more hidden tragedies that rewrote history, and comment your thoughts on when love becomes treason.